when it comes to developments over there. And I think as long as the Palestinians are still on the ground, physically present, this does not go away. And so there will be a moment when one has to circle back and say, how does one deal with the situation? I think it's important to position the administration in terms of what is the continuity and what is the change vis-a-vis past American administrations. And I think it is both. And I think it's clearly you have not had an America that has been able to deliver on an end of occupation, an end of settlements, and to the extent to which there was a ballpark of a sense of what the two-state outcome might have to look like, America did not summon up, if you will, to use the political leverage, even when the finishing line may have been in sight, to carry, especially on the Israeli side, there is a power asymmetry here, and one is power by people to carry them across the finish line. So there's nothing new in that inability. But I think there is change, just outlined some of the ways in which we've seen it. Because I think there was a sense of a direction of travel over decades across administrations. And there was a sense that where American and Israeli maximalism did not coincide, one had to spell that out. Sometimes in more forceful ways, more often in far less forceful ways, but that had to be spelled out. And in terms of this end destination of a two-state, that the parameters of which became clearer and clearer over time, and I think were most clearly explained by Secretary Kerry right at the late up end of the Obama administration, speaking in December of 2016. But that journey began, assessment, but certainly when the lame duck period of the Reagan administration, at the beginning of an American PLO dialogue, Bush, Madrid, through Clinton, etc., that sense of an end destination, which may or may not have been sustainable, but the idea that there would be a Palestine alongside Israel would then have to deal with its own question of what kind of state it wanted to be within its own borders. There's a Jewish and demographic tension also within Israel. But that is what is happening. And yes, there is an ideological alignment, clearly, between this administration and the increasingly rightward grip of Israeli politics, exemplified by the coalition of Prime Minister Akankah. The paper that you were referring to, running that headline, running yet another interview with President Trump in Israel, Hayom, nothing more exemplified than ideological alignment than Sheldon Adelson, Joel Duke's interview here. Well, that alignment, by the way, throws up a new political opportunity for the United States that we may discuss later on, but I'll skate past that right now. And so I think what you see in this administration is a coming together, and it's all rowing in the same direction, a coming together of some for whom you can kind of beat the Palestinians into submission, into accepting a deal that falls well short of offering a state, of offering a future, of offering sovereignty, well short of the previous parameters. Some who feel that that can be achieved, perhaps with threats, with economic inducements. I think others for whom that is an irrelevance, but for whom there is an ideological and even religious, emotional to not only Israel, but the project of Greater Israel. I think we saw that on display in the Vice President at the Israeli Parliament just last month. And I would really emphasize this, but the role that the ambassador to Israel appointed by this administration, David Friedman, plays, who has a lifetime of ideological alignment with even the outer reaches of the Israeli settlement national religious Greater Israel. The extent to which he drives his policy will not be underestimated. And I think what's important to note is, and this is kind of where the ultimate demise is being attempted to come into play, there are certain folks who are in a hurry, who are looking at this period of the Trump administration to say, how can we make as much as possible as irreversible as possible? And I think that's where it's not incorrect to say you don't have a policy. You have Netanyahu's settlement policy on Israel-Palestine right now. And that's about making Jerusalem irreversible, making the refugee issue irreversible, that described, making the territory issue irreversible. And perhaps undermining the prospect of any kind of Palestinian solution. Now, what does that mean in terms of the reality on the ground? And here I think it raises some questions that are more interesting. What is the direction of travel of this? And I think it raises questions that are more interesting than what might be the minutiae what might be the rest of the what might be discussing the role. Because I think this administration is acting in many respects as an accelerant. They're putting their foot on the accelerator of trends that were playing out kind of in slow motion. This sense of, is that the two-state solution? Is it gone yet? They've put their foot on the accelerator. And I think that's the headline. And I think several threads flow from that. One thread is the trends in Israel. If you can now get away with anything, if you can, even as an Israeli Prime Minister, in arguing with your own right-wing coalition, you can no longer hide behind, well, we can't annex because the Americans won't let us. Even though it was an open question, wouldn't let us. If you can no longer hide behind that, what does that do to the trend inside Israel? What does the increasingly palpable sense of permanent Israeli entrenchment, disenfranchisement of Palestinians do to the notion of how will Palestinians achieve their freedom rights? It plays out on the Palestinian. Where does the Palestinian national go next? To what extent is it conceivable to adhere to the kind of process of an American-driven two-state option that has been essentially the modus operandi for a quarter of a century plus? And of course it plays out in the region. To what extent can you create a new Pax Americana regional dynamic that is partly predicated on being against the Palestinians? It's partly predicated on the negation of the Palestinians. I would argue there's only so far you can go with that, by the way. We're beginning to see that there's only so far you can go with that. So to circle back and draw this to a close, you can't, I don't think it is a realistic expectation that whoever comes to office, given the conditions in January 2017, was going to make two states come about in short order. Personally, I think the deal that we discussed in the past were given, were concretized, then there is still a Palestinian for that. I don't think it's going inside for some time. It's clearly coalition. There are things you could have done as an administration to help eventually circle back to a meaningful process. You could have put an emphasis on seeing through the process of internal Palestinian reconciliation and improving conditions in Gaza. You could have put an emphasis on how do you challenge Israeli impunity? Because the more you indulge the unreasonable, significant portions of Israeli policy, the more you're encouraging those policies. So how could you, and this would be unlikely to be an American-led thing, but it could be an American-encouraged thing, as we saw in the UN Security Council right at the death of the Obama administration. That's clearly not what's happening. What I think is happening is what can best be described as a win-win, an attempt at a win-win for the Israeli government and for the Friedman policy. And that win-win is as follows. Either by threatening the withdrawal of financial aid, by withdrawing financial aid, by threatening the office here, by threatening repercussions on the Palestinians, and by offering inducements, there'll be lots of money, perhaps from the Gulf, if you do X, Y, Z. If that succeeds, then what you are asking the Palestinians to do is to become partners in the, I think the right word is apartheid, in the apartheid system that one is trying to impose on them, which I think is very unlikely to happen and very ill-advised from their perspective. Or you blame the Palestinians. You say, we were trying to do a peace deal, the Palestinians don't want to come to the table, they're walking away, they're to blame. And then Israel can get on and do the things that were going to be part of the plan anyway, in terms of entrenching and formalizing apartheid. So that's why I call it a win-win. Where I think this is not so simple, as I said, is because as long as the Palestinians are there on the ground, what this actually does is it acts as I've suggested, an accelerant in bringing to a head, one could call it one state versus two states, but I think it's right now at least more sensible to think in terms of it brings to a head the question of where do Palestinians realize their rights and their freedom and their enfranchisement. And it brings to a head the question of how do you address the power dynamics in this country. Because the great failure of the peace process was the embedded assumption that with this kind of a power asymmetry, and with nothing closing that power asymmetry, you would actually get the powerful party to disengage from occupation in a way that would be a give to the disempowered. And the disempowered party thought America would deliver the closing of this gap. And that's not happening. America won't deliver the closing of that gap. And inevitably, you therefore have to, as has been needed for some time, have to look elsewhere for how to address that power dynamic. And I would close with one thought, which is look at the power, at least the latent power in someone like Nahid. Look at what that does. People not familiar with the story, a young woman who turned 17, I believe, just now, currently under arrest, currently awaiting sentencing, trial and sentencing. A young woman, who herself and her family deeply involved in the non-violent, popular civil resistance in their town. That notion, whether it's popular civil resistance, whether it's other forms that are going to challenge that power dynamic, those and many other things will come to the fore, I think, over this next period. But I don't expect either the attempt to have Palestinians embrace the terms of their own permanent second-class status, or the attempt to successfully convince people that Palestinians are to blame. I don't think either of those are going to succeed.
So I want to pick up where you left off on where do Palestinians go from here. I want to quote from someone you know, Henry Siegman, who's the former head of the American Jewish Congress. He wrote that the rise of fascism in Israel is a direct byproduct of Israel's 50-year military occupation over Palestinians. And he argued that the Palestinian struggle for a state of their own is one Palestinians cannot win, while the struggle to maintain an apartheid regime is one Israel cannot win. So Amjad, where do you think Palestinians go from here?
Well, first of all, thank you, Zaha, for having me here. I'm very happy to be with you. I'm very happy to be with Daniel, and also happy to be in America. It's great to be here on the cusp of a historic visit. To describe it, yes, we're almost there. To have a look at it before the train ride. I wanted to concentrate, I think, on, you asked where do the Palestinians go from here, and I think the Palestinians need to actually internalize that there have been three transformative changes. There's a fourth one that Daniel talked extensively about, which is what happened here in the United States with effectively the settler ideology of Israel being transplanted into the United States. In a sense, all the checks and balances that might exist inside Israel to actually hold that back haven't actually worked here. And so in many ways, you may actually have people that are further to the right, and I'm including the evangelical, part of the evangelical community that has been a stalwart supporter of Israeli antagonistic actions against Palestinians as part of an eschatological end of times perception. And so I wanted to concentrate on three other elements and that I think are getting underplayed. One is, and it's easy to get underplayed because in a sense none of these are new. It's just been the frog in the pot, in the boiling pot. The water's getting warmer, the water's getting warmer, the water's getting warmer. All of a sudden, oh my God, it's boiling and I'm dead. And I think that on each of these elements, we've seen the elements leading up to it, but it's gotten to such an extreme now that in fact I think it could be a transformative moment. So the first one is the change in Arab relations vis-a-vis the Palestinian struggle. It's not, the Arab world has always been, in a way, the ultimate prize for a two-state solution for Israel, right? It's been the other side of that balance. It hasn't been that Palestinians would be at peace with Israel. It's been that the entire Arab world, and by a larger extension, the entire Muslim majority world, would be at peace with Israel and would have normalized relations with Israel, which would provide Israel with an inducement to have a two-state solution. The first break in that was actually Camp David, where you could, with Egypt, where you could actually have, well, no, we can take the strongest Arab country and we can have a peace agreement with the strongest Arab country and not provide the Palestinians with their piece of it. And in fact, you remember William Quant's famous, who worked with Jimmy Carter on the agreement, whose famous comment to Jimmy Carter, while they were negotiating, Jimmy Carter was desperately trying to get a Palestinian component to Camp David included, and at one point he told the Mr. President, he can't be more pro-Palestinian than the Egyptian president. And and a few years later, once Egypt was removed from that perspective, Israel was able to invade Lebanon and attempt to destroy the Palestinian national movement with PLO in Lebanon. To see how far things have come now. number of years ago when I was still working advising the Palestinians, I was in a meeting with senior Saudi government official, the senior Palestinian official, and the purpose of the meeting and the conversation was about the Palestinian constitution and whether it was going to be a republican form of government or a parliamentary form of government. And the Saudi government was very concerned that the Palestinians weren't being aspirational enough in promoting a constitution that could be a model for the future change that the Arab world was in desperate need of. This was the words from the Saudi government official to the Palestinian. The Palestinian made a joke about, we've been thinking about all kinds of models, including the Saudi model, and the Saudi government official responded very seriously, this is not a joke. The form of government you pick and the constitution you pick will be the most important decision you make as a national movement. Now, go from there to this current Saudi leadership instructing the Palestinian president and the head of the Palestinian national movement that he's going to have to accept a deal that effectively codifies the existing situation on the ground as some kind of a peace agreement in order for Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel, and that if he doesn't do it, they're going to find somebody else who can accept that deal. That's a huge change. In between 1980 and 1978, when the Egypt deal with Israel, and now 2018, you have actually something that is on the order of magnitude as great, which is now you have Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and other Arab Emirates prepared to normalize relations with Israel on terms completely unacceptable to Palestinians, completely unacceptable to what was the consensus Arab position that Saudi Arabia itself helped to find with the Arab League decision that they put forward. Now, so I think this is causing a fundamental shift in alliances in the region, not just based on affirmative interests where we all get 2,000 put together, but more as in, oh my God, this is going to be a disaster for us. How do we defend ourselves? In Jordan, Turkey, Qatar, Iran, Kuwait, Oman, Tunisia, you have a kind of strange assortment of countries now that are outside of the picture that sees actually chaos and catastrophe coming down the pipe, and they're trying to figure out desperately how they can actually stop that from happening. So the Palestinian national movement has always sort of worked in this weird dating space where it's got to ride the razor's edge, where it's got to have good relations with all the Arab governments, it's got to rely on them for financial support, but at the same time it wants to maintain its independent decision making. And that's what Yasser Arafat did, was to be able to maintain a certain level of Palestinian independent decision making. And that doesn't exist right now. So the way the Palestinians respond to that, I think, is actually going to be critical. The second element is, and Daniel alluded to this question of partition and non-partition. We've worked for so long on the idea that there was going to be a partition that we've forgotten, that the Palestinians for the longest time, it's been very often said, the Palestinians would accept the people's position. It's true. PLO's position was to demand a secular democratic state in all of historic Palestine with equal rights for all of its citizens. Now, at a certain point in time, the national movement decided to become pragmatic and say, well, this is not a practice. We won't be able to lead a successful anti-apartheid struggle, and so we're going to make a practical, pragmatic decision that instead we will agree to a partition. The original partition was a roughly 50-50 split, 51-49 split. This time, we will accept the 78-22 split. And then, of course, the Israelis were in the dominant position and didn't need to accept the refugee plan. So the Israelis didn't accept the refugee plan, but they talked about it and they negotiated about it, but they never accepted it. So now we're at a position where a partition plan used to be 100-0. 100% for Israel, 0% for Palestinians. 0% sovereignty for Palestinians. Palestinians would be confined to their cities, where Israelis are always relying on 90% land structure. Reminding everybody again that 90% of all Palestinians are used like 7 Palestinians. And so, Palestinians can be confined to a very, very small area that constitutes 10 to 13% of the Palestine, and then the rest of Israel, for Saudi and Emirati money influence to build up those areas, build businesses, etc. It's presented as a very, very realistic, very possible scenario. Now, considered from a Palestinian perspective, of course, that's the culmination. That would be the end of the Palestinian national movement. And so the question for Palestinians then is, all right, do we even still believe this? You can split this on the 78-22% split. Is that even realistic anymore? Do we believe it? I remember a conversation when I was leaving Palestine. I had with a number of Palestinian sources, and I said, do you really think that you're going to be able to get a state on the 67 border? A lot of them said, probably not. So why are we still fighting for it? Why are we still agitating for it? I said, well, what else are we going to advocate for? I said, well, why wouldn't you advocate for equal rights? Why wouldn't you advocate for democracy? Why wouldn't you advocate for nationalism? Or, there are like 10 different countries in the world that have, multiple models of integration. Why don't you argue for that? So the Israelis, most people respond to the Israelis as too racist. They will not accept the live with Palestinians and with us in equality in some way. And then I went back to, do you think they're going to give you a state on 22%? So that's the dilemma then, right? From a pragmatic, practical perspective, the Israelis are not going to allow a state to be created on 22% of historic Palestine. If the Israelis are not going to allow that to happen, what are Palestinians actually, what should they spend their time advocating for? What should the Palestinian national movement advocate for that would capture the heart, the soul, and the imagination of the worldwide Palestinian community, as well as the international support network that Palestine historically had? It was very easy when Palestine was an iconic national movement on par with apartheid South Africa, right, for Palestine to generate diplomatic support from all over the world outside of the United States and Northern European countries. It was much harder when it became a democratic argument about whether they were going to be 4 checkpoints around Ramallah or 2 checkpoints around Ramallah, or whether there's going to be a road between Gaza and Hebron. That the transformation of the conflict from an iconic national one to a question of, would the road be under the ground or over the ground? We lost the audience. And we spent too much time. It's one thing if you already decided on the big picture, and then you're deciding whether the road goes underground or overground. But we never agreed on the big picture. There's a third one. It also says that the Palestinians used to be very there used to be a national, this is the thing after Arafat, was that it created a national movement that constituted all Palestinians. So there were Palestinian representative bodies in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, everywhere. They were all sort of somehow to the PLO, that were a national council that represented Palestinians. All had intellectual giants like Ibrahim Abu Lughad and Edward Said, and people who were their own icons in their own right, Relief Haredi, and these people, in a sense, created Palestinian national identity that that still we have a memory of. But the actual body that created it now has been fragmented. So now when we think about Palestine, we think about Palestinian rights, in for example, we're actually talking about the Muslims. We're actually talking about PLO, Palestinian Authority system that's based on the Muslims. And if you were in different parts of the Middle East, you'd be talking about that. And you'd be talking about the Hamas government in Gaza. And if you were in an activist, group somewhere in Europe or the United States, we might be talking about the right of return, we might be talking about CBS, we might be talking about, but it's not all connected into a national movement. And the one part that's completely missing from our, it doesn't mean it didn't exist, we have it supposed to, has been the Palestinians for citizens of Israel, which constitute about a fifth of Israel's population. The citizens of Israel, they don't have full equal rights, but they have more political rights than Palestinians do in other countries in the Middle East. And they speak Hebrew fluently, they speak Arabic fluently, they speak English fluently, they're well-versed in civil rights movements around the world, they're well-versed in apartheid movements, and in many ways they've taken a back seat, quietly been watching, advocating for peace, but quietly waiting and watching, waiting for this peace agreement to happen, so that they can concentrate after that on improving the rights of Palestinians inside Israel. And now they're not waiting anymore. So, the third largest bloc in the Israeli Knesset is actually the Joint List, which is composed primarily of Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. And that Joint List now is working on proposing legislation in the Knesset to transform Israel into a egalitarian citizen state with equal rights for all of the citizens, regardless of religion, regardless of anything. Now this is actually, I think, a pivotal moment in Israel, not because I think that legislation will pass, but because I believe that this is the beginning of a public civil rights movement, the beginning of a discourse. 100 elements preceded it, 1,000 things were done by groups like Adala, like others, to help feed the ground to get to this point. And now you're actually having the most sophisticated response to Israel's oppression coming from Palestinians who are inside Israel. So I think, again, the challenge for Palestinians is, how do we link all this together? How does all of this form a nationalistic argument? How do we form a national movement out of all of these discussions? And I think, so right now, if this was a stock market, this would be a crash. Like we're in the middle of a stock market crash. Everybody's selling. It's going to be hard to do that. That means that there are opportunities to find. There are opportunities to find ways to actually start rebuilding the Palestinian national movement and gaining leverage over Israel outside of the dominant paradigm that exists. Do we just wait until the U.S. government changes its mind? Okay, let's say that this particular government has taken a particularly disastrous attitude towards two states as the Palestinians understood it. But the previous governments that have worked for this, whether it was Obama's administration, whether it was Bush's administration, etc., also couldn't get themselves, as Daniel said, couldn't get themselves to bridge that gap, right? Bill Clinton couldn't bridge that gap, and he was desperate for an agreement, right? Bush couldn't bridge that gap, and he actually wanted an agreement. I was in the meeting when Zinni was sent as the envoy to resolve, to stop the Intifada and to have a peace agreement. And we were in the first meeting with him, and all the Palestinians were sitting on one side, and Zinni and Aaron, I think Aaron was with him, Aaron Miller, and a team of Americans on the other side. And Zinni said, I've been sent here by the president to stop the violence and to create a Palestinian state. And I've been told not to come back until I create a Palestinian state. And then he said, and I don't expect to be away from my wife for that long. And he meant it. Zinni was actually absolutely 100% sincere. He meant it. He thought that he was actually going to end the conflict and he was going to quickly get to a Palestinian state. And the challenge that they all came up against was, oh, but the Israelis weren't actually prepared for the partition. And in this administration is the first that's recognized, it seems, and internalized that Israel doesn't want the partition.
But might we not be one administration away from a significant change in U.S. policy towards Israel-Palestine? I mean, we've had some really interesting polling come out, and I want to focus our attention on that. The Pew Research poll that shows that Palestine and Israel are becoming there's more of a partisan divide between Republicans and Democrats than ever before. So that now we see sympathies for Israel among Republicans at 79%, increasing. The trends are increasing. And yet, among Democrats, it's around 27% sympathy towards Israel. And among Democrats, it's about even between sympathizing with Palestinians and sympathizing with Israelis. Liberal Democrats, 2 times as much support or sympathize with Palestinians. So we're seeing some kind of change happening in the U.S. And I think also the Telhemi poll that was done that talked about the increasing sense among Americans that they like to see the U.S. take serious action or economic sanctions against Israel for continuing settlement construction shows that Americans are starting to view this conflict differently. We're starting to see some change happening among the way Americans think about the conflict, and that has to bubble up. And we've seen sort of during the last presidential campaigns, with Bernie Sanders' campaign, that it's not a negative to talk about Palestinian human rights or humanitarian issues. It's not going to hurt you. In fact, it can help you among your constituency. And I'm noticing in D.C. also among members of Congress an increasing interest and willingness to stand up for Palestinian rights and to stand up against this administration's position on Palestinian matters with Israel. So might we be just one administration away from seeing some real change in the way we conduct ourselves with Israel?
I think that we're always one administration away, whether here or in Israel, from seeing significant change. The question is how to translate those very real changes that are happening in the current system, how to actually translate that into actual policy. And I think that there is probably a more important country in the United States in terms of focusing, besides Israel, in terms of focusing, getting that change to happen. That civil rights movement that started in Israel, that civil rights movement has to be an extension here in the United States as well. Because there is no country on earth that is more instrumental in allowing Israel to be the kind of country that it is right now and to maintain the occupation that it maintains in the United States. And so, yes, I agree 100% with you. The challenge is now, as we see these demographic trends, as we see these changes in people's attitudes, to continue that process, but to transform that into actual political change.
Open to that future for the rest of you.
Hi, my name is Dimitri. Thank you very much. Very interesting. I have 2 questions. The first one is about Russia's stance on what's going on in Israel, Palestine. I know they recognize West and East Jerusalem or in their statement. Just curious what their interests are. And the second one is about what the Palestinians are doing at the United Nations, if that has any significance, or if you can see the UN somehow bridging the gap, the power gap that you're talking about. Thank you.
On Russia, I think Russia has different interests. Russia has had a position that wanted to stick to UN resolutions of international legality on the Israel-Palestine question. So that part of the Russian line. There's a close relationship with another. There's a million plus Israelis from the former Soviet Union. There's relations with that community that drives part of it. Russia has played a role in trying to facilitate Palestinian reconciliation. But I think Russia will continue to stand with a traditional approach to the different Trump administration approach to resolution. Russia, this is also not the arena in which Russia wants to take over. Russia does not want to take over mediator, broker, lead actor. They'll swan in and out and they'll play a role, but it's not like a series where this could be driven by a Russian movement, as far as I see.
Also, this is part of the Israeli population, the Israeli citizens are Russian, funded. So I think Russia So, that's interesting, right? As far as well, there's a lot that can be done. Do a lot codify international positions, reasserting them as important at a time. So it's important, but I think it has to be part of it. Not strategy. I don't think one option works. It'd be like 10 with one touchdown. It's not one strategy. But if you've got part of that campaign, you've got basically what the Europeans recognize the state of Palestine on greater managed to introduce Palestine into greater bodies, and the United States can pull out of every one that they want. They can pull out of UNESCO. They can pull out of all of the different bodies if they want. That actually doesn't hurt Palestine. It's just self-defeating to the United States. And so, yes, I think there's something there that can. I think there is something there that can be done. I think the Palestinian ambassador at the UN has helped orchestrate, a number of very interesting and clever approaches to trying to keep that highlighted. But it's not a silver bullet.
Just to add on the UN, I think Israel understands that that is a space, a format where sanctioning of illegal Israeli action could come into play in ways that do impact that power dynamic, which is a reason that over so many years, so much time, effort, and resources have been invested in trying to make the argument that the UN is an illegitimate place in which to have an Israel-Palestine debate, which is nonsense. But there's an awful lot invested in trying to convince American people, the Jewish American community, the American body politic, that whatever else we do, we can't allow stuff to happen in the UN. That's not because, for instance, something like what's happening in the UN Human Rights Council right now, which is mandated to produce a database of companies involved in a whole list of practices that go against the UN charters and conventions in the settlements. I think that's important. It's important that it happens. It's important that those companies are made public. And that is a big fight that's taking place right now, and that is an example of somewhere why we have tangible that facilitate tangible campaigning and mobilizations. You also have a phenomenon right now at the UN, which I think is unprecedented. You've had former American ambassadors to the United Nations who have gone on to become president, actually. There's never been a direct step. You could ever run, I don't think anyone has ever run that campaign, potentially for the presidency from the UN, from being UN ambassador. That is happening. It's fair to say. And Ambassador Haley has, I think, absolute political sense for her within the department. Donor base makes absolute sense for her to be running that campaign off the back of the Palestinian community, off the back of the beating of Palestinians. I think we've seen no uncertainty.
Ask you about, to me, this whole backlash against UNRWA was more than just about Palestinian refugees. It was about making sure that the UN and international community realized there's a price to pay to stand with Palestinians. So it was to make the address for Palestinians, it was to destroy any address for Palestinians and to scare the UN and its agencies from actually taking a more proactive role. Do you agree with that? Do you see that as,
I do. I think
go around the world and look for
I think something, I agree, I think something important is going on there. And again, I think the Palestinians are the unfortunate people on the receiving end of this. I think the president saw that going too far head-to-head with the North Koreans is complicated. The Pentagon has all kinds of things to say about whether it's such a good idea and our equities in South Korea, etc. Going like this with Iran is complicated. These aren't these places with a certain deterrent capacity. Beating up the Palestinians is actually really easy. And I think, in a way, the president's found his match. I mean, there just seemed to be, I think the president was tickled by the idea of doing the deal that no former president has done, and I don't want to go too far into the speculation about what's supposed to do this. But there seemed to be a comfort level in this Davos press conference with Netanyahu and President Trump about beating up on the Palestinians. As you say, there is a price to pay, and it's easiest to demonstrate that price with the Palestinians than with anyone else. So,
Because again, it's about narrowing the options for Palestinians, so there is no other address. It's either the U.S. as mediator or nothing, or you get what you get.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think you're right in the first point. I don't know if I think the U.S. is the only. I don't think anybody's like rising up to say we'll take over, or we're happy to take ownership over this issue. I think but I think where the limitations of what the United States are doing, because I think you're right about the punishment part, right? But where the limitations are is that the United States gets a Security Council resolution where every one of its historic core allies votes against it, like immediately, like within 24 hours. The Pope criticizes the Jerusalem statement, like actually I think he did it an hour before the statement.
Fighting international law.
Right, so yeah, and so you're seeing also the limitations of U.S. voting, right? So the General Assembly vote, then after the Security Council goes to the General Assembly, the United States threatens, tells people in advance, sends letters, tells them, we're going to punish you if you vote against us. And a great majority of countries still vote, including for U.S. allies. I mean,
and largest recipients of U.S. assistance.
And the largest recipients of U.S. assistance still go ahead and vote for it. And so, in a sense, if anybody was going to be doing this to help the suffer enterprise, it's best for the Palestinians that it's the Trump administration. Because the Trump administration has developed so many enemies on so many fronts, on so many issues that there's international consensus on, that taking a stand on Palestine is actually a lot. If Obama had wanted to do some of this, the countries wouldn't have been able to stand up against it. But with Trump, they wouldn't be able.
With one, if I could just add, with one caveat, which is, I think there's also a phenomenon where is Israel-Palestine in your order of priorities? If you're another country close to America that has issues with this administration, where is Israel-Palestine in your order of priorities of what you challenge the administration? So here, for instance, I think the expectation that Europe might play a greater role should be very modest and limited, because Iran nuclear deal, Paris climate change, those things are going to be, understandably North Korea, are going to be higher on the priority list. One thing, just to do justice to your Russia question, don't underestimate also the significance in terms of Israel-Russia relationship of the position Israel has taken on Ukraine, where Israel has never voted with the Americans against Russia on Ukraine. Israel has not been part of sanctions, and that is noticed whatsoever.
There's another piece from within this equation, from within the Israeli domestic politics, that I'd like you to address. I mean, you talked about the right-wing drift in Israel and the alignment with evangelicals and other forces in the U.S. What about the rest of the space in Israel, the center and the rest? I mean, we could have seen quite a different outcome in the last Israeli elections. In fact, many of us thought until the last moment we were going with that. I mean, how is that playing out right now? And in particular, how is also that playing out with the role of the growing number of Israeli Arabs and their role? I'm not sure where that stands.
Can we take a couple more up here at the front, and then
Yes, I heard refer to bringing up Avichai's piece in terms of the concentration of Palestinians in cities and the lack of agriculture and so on. I wonder if you would amplify your views about Confederation, especially as he spelled it out in that piece.
Hello, I'm Catherine Hughes-Freytek, and I've been involved in this issue now 30 plus years, so it was great to hear a really good, I think, overview and analysis on what's going on and historical. Also good to hear the focus on grassroots movements, and we know the strength of the First Intifada and how that helped with the power imbalance, kind of move it, as well as what's happening now and the importance of unity, which is a big issue with Palestine. My two questions are, one, could you do a little bit of analysis on the security alliances that Israel's been building up around the world? Jeff Halper had a good book that talked about this, but the fact that they're training police, security, the drones, the military all over the world, including with India, Asia, et cetera, and how that's impacting kind of the balance of power as we go forward. And then also, Amjad, a little bit more, I thought it was so important, the Israeli-Palestinian role in moving forward, and how, whether it's the Confederation or just in general, how you see them playing a key role in then trying to again unify and use them as a key player if it becomes a civil rights movement, which may be the only option.
So it's true that if one narrowly looks at the parties on the right, to the Israeli internal political picture, the parties of the right and the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox, it's 65, 66, 67, centre right, 50, 53, 55, and at one point before the last election, the polls suggested it might be a lot closer to 66, 60. Where that math goes astray is not particularly illuminating in understanding Israeli politics is no Jewish Zionist party is willing to go into coalition with non-Zionists. So the Joint List, which is the third largest party in the Israeli state is not actually part of that map, because the so-called left of Israel do not consider them legitimate coalition partners, which is just remarkable. In narrow political self-interest terms, if nothing else, but it's remarkable in much deeper ways than that. So it's hard to see how there's an alternative coalition. And so even when the numbers get tighter, the right is always at a massive advantage when it comes to putting a government together, number one. Number two, you do not have a robust opposition on any of the issues we've been discussing. It's true that the right could lose power based on corruption, bad governance, what may happen to Netanyahu. There's a fight, an emerging fight in the right now as to whether it is better to cling to Netanyahu or abandon him because of the corruption allegations and the likelihood of a police recommendation that criminal charges be filed next week, actually. Because the right could lose power, not because of its ideological position on any of these issues, but because now perhaps it makes electoral sense for the centre and centre-left to be saying, let's not fight this election on any of the Palestinian peace-related issues, occupation, human rights, democracy, etc. Let's just fight it on corruption. Maybe that makes electoral sense. But the problem is they've drifted so far in that direction, they won't have a mandate. So this can change. I want to acknowledge that. It can change. Electoral politics is fluid everywhere, I think. But you have not, for a generation, had an Israeli opposition leader who has tried to offer an alternative way forward, an alternative narrative to the Israeli public on any of this. And it really does, and this is where Amjad's point about the civil rights movement and the role of the Palestinian citizens in Israel, I really think you can only probably build political change off the back of that, off the back of the non-right camp of Israel revisiting the nature of what kind of Israel they're talking about, and then that is about the relationship with their fellow non-Zionist citizens inside their own communities, which I think then would carry over to how to find the Palestinians across the line. And perhaps if that challenge comes out of the Palestinian community inside Israel and really places a mirror in front of the more liberal inside Israel, maybe that's where I think that is interesting. And if the attempt by the joint list is well, it's not going to be successful, but if it's adhered to, if this theme is, you just stick with it. These things don't change overnight. This is a multiple-year push. That's a very big deal.
Yeah, I think, and just follow up on that. I think that's exactly right, and I think that it has to become part of a movement and part of the identity of a wing of Israeli politics that actually is almost post-Zionist. It's looking forward to a future in Israel where everybody is has equality, no more than the system with tiered rights for different religious communities and tiered rights for different groups, and lack of participation for some groups, etc. Now, what role that can play in a larger Palestinian national movement, I think, is also an interesting question, I think, to your point. And how can that happen? I mean, I think at some point there has to be a conscious effort, the conscious effort and maybe unconscious effort on the Palestinian national movement side has been to increasingly get smaller, right? So I mean, take the Hamas leadership, which at one point aspired to like take over the whole Palestinian national movement, right? But now whenever you talk, when you listen to Hamas discourse, it's about, you know, I mean, it's exactly the same as what the people that they attack and they make fun of. You know, they're talking about Gaza, they're talking about what, you know, the checkpoints, they're talking about the borders of Gaza, they're talking about the agreement with, you know, can they cut a separate agreement with Egypt, separate from the agreement that Ramallah is cutting, etc. It's prison politics. The Palestinians, I think, I forget the percentage of Palestinians who've served in Israeli prisons or who've been detained, and it's remarkably high. And in those prisons, Palestinians end up, you know, you join a group. I mean, you're either with Fatah or you're with Hamas or you're with the PFLP or the DFLP or Islamic Jihad, or, you know, you effectively join a faction, a gang, and then they provide you with protection, and then, you know, they indoctrinate, there's indoctrination, and you work together and then you can cooperate together, and you can come up, you know, different groups will work together, have strikes to demand better visitation rights, etc. But that's what's happened to the Palestinian national movement. It's actually fragmented into prison politics. And so, you know, it's like, how many cigarettes are we going to get? You know, why aren't you allowing us enough visitors to come in? Which are all remarkably valuable, important things for Palestinian prisoners in jails to be arguing for, but not necessarily the kinds of things that the Palestinian national leadership should be focusing the national attention on. And so I think now there has to be a conscious decision to get out of the little pond and go back into the international pond. And that international pond of Palestinians everywhere. There are more Palestinians from Bethlehem in Chile than there are in Bethlehem. I think there are more Palestinians from Ramallah and in the United States and maybe in Elvira. So it's a very, you know, this community would be a very powerful, the diaspora community was a driving engine of the Palestinian national movement for a very long time. The Palestinians inside Israel now can also be, I think, part of that driving movement. And then I'll just comment on the Avishai. I wasn't referring to the Avishai, I was referring to a piece that Dennis Ross had written, but I've read the Avishai piece, I think in the New York Review of Books, right? And I mean, I don't have an opinion on it. I'll just say this though. I think what's happening is that you're beginning to see a debate. It's interesting in the United States, at least in the West, which is fascinating that it's coming here, because it's not as if Palestinians haven't been discussing these issues for 20 years. But now you're seeing it among Zionists. And so you're seeing a conversation take place, and it starts with the Roger Cohen throwaway paragraph, you know, in his argument about attacking Abu Mazen and saying why Abu Mazen should resign. And then he has a paragraph where he throws in, and of course, a one-state solution is impossible. You know, it's just like a throwaway. It's just, you know, it's just not, forget it, don't even think about equality. Equality is not possible. So it's just a throwaway paragraph there. And then you start moving to, well, Palestinians, if you think Palestinians are going to argue for equality in a US style or in a South African style citizen state, then what's your response to it? And then the response is, look, I know you want equality, but maybe what if it's a negotiation, right? So now confederation is better than equality. Confederation would be less problematic than a full state. But it's a conversation, and that's a conversation that needs to happen. It's a conversation that needs to happen among Zionists, but it's also a conversation that needs to happen among Palestinians as well, in terms of, you know, what is that range? But the negotiation is going to start. The fear I have as somebody who cares about the Palestinian side getting their justice, is that if the Palestinians are too slow to engage in this conversation, this will become a conversation among liberal Zionists as to, you know, no offense.
None taken.
It'll become a conversation among liberal Zionists as to how Israel can best moderate and how Israel can best, you know, maintain as much privilege as possible while allowing equality. That's still good. It's a good conversation to have. But I'd like Palestinians to also be at that table having that conversation on their own terms.
You use the word national movements. I'd like to change that narrative and call it a civil rights movement. If we look at the United States, what happened here in Selma, Alabama, and sometimes I dream that we have Calandia. And for those who don't know, Calandia is a very famous checkpoint in Palestine. If we turn this whole thing, I mean, the civil rights movement when Martin Luther King and so on was a national movement, but was a local, domestic movement. And if we think of a civil rights movement, this is where I think the younger generation in Palestine and all over the world will understand it much, much better than a national movement, considering the local domestic dynamics of what happened here in the elections and who supports election, who donates, etc. I think that what's happening now is that young people care more about not civil rights necessarily, but equal rights. So I'm trying to think of do we have a Martin Luther King in Palestine today? Maybe yes, maybe Abbas should be a Martin Luther King. And look at it from a civil rights aspect, where is, I think, the only hope to get international support. All the rest, the big politics, there's too many, it's too complicated. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, all of this. But I think only movement people understand, especially the young people who are the whole day on their telephones, smartphones, and so on, could make a difference. Thank you.
But
Go ahead.
could I just,
Yeah,
I want to
yeah.
comment to Zahi's point, because Zahi, I think, you know who most eloquently, I think, argued something similar was Ehud Olmert. In an article, was it an interview with Thomas Friedman, I think, in New Yorker many years ago when Ehud Olmert was still prime minister. And he argued that the reason he was arguing for why they needed to divest the Palestinians and have a two-state solution. He said because Palestinians at some point will demand equal rights. He said Israel can't win a civil rights movement. Israel can't win. He said it's not because we're not powerful enough. He said it's because we'll lose the Jewish community in the diaspora. And we'll lose the Jewish community in the United States in particular.
That's starting to happen.
And he said when that happens, we lose them, we won't be able to stand. So he said that's why. So it was his argument to American Jews, basically. He was trying to make an argument to American Jews why he needed to quickly find a way to divest Palestinians.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes. I want to come back on this, but perhaps after we do.
I am Amal David.
Use your microphone.
I would like Amal David from Arab America Media, and I like to know, as an American of Palestinian background, I like to know what's the single most effective act Palestinians can do to change American policy towards Palestine.
Can I, while you're thinking about that, let me pick up on what Zahi said. Because, well, let me put it like this. I think that as long as the Palestinian position continues to be predicated around the old two-state paradigm, it's easy to drag this into a conversation about percentages of territory, at which you can get nickeled and dimed indefinitely, in perpetuity. I think the moment this becomes about rights, it's a whole different conversation. And as you said, it's a conversation where very hard if you are not ethno-nationalist, and there's no shortage of them today in America or in Israel or elsewhere. But that's not the majority. It's very hard to hold your ground. It's a very difficult struggle. Now, the upshot of that struggle, and also, unlike the old PLO, the PLO on the secular democratic state, PLO position on the secular democratic state didn't really have a message for the Israeli Jewish national collective. And the equal rights struggle does have to be. By the way, it probably requires a rethink on anti-normalization on in Palestinian society. You have to think long and hard what is the correct type of engagement and cooperation with Jewish Israelis. You can't just kind of blanket through anti-normalization. But I think that struggle, if effective, if pursued over a long period of time, if non-violent, generates one of two, if successful, one of two Israeli responses. Either dust off those old files about two states, what might they be willing to accept? Oh, they're not going to accept that anymore. And then it's up to the Palestinians to decide whether a genuine end of occupation, genuine Palestinian independent state, whether that's now something that is worth going for or not. The other thing that I think is really important in what you said, Rafi, is 2018. Even the term #National Liberation Movement, it doesn't resonate. I think there was a moment of the kind of classic national liberation movement struggle, and I think that was the moment of potential success of the PLO in the 1990s. And that moment may have simply passed from the global scene. And I think the longer the PLO thinks of itself in those terms, the more likely